Today is January 11th, 2021. My name is Ann Shi. I'm with the Houston Asian American Archive. We'll be interviewing Mr. Kao Chang today for his oral history. Thank you so much, Carol, for joining us.
Thanks for having me here. Pleased to be able to do this.
Great, thank you. Let's get started. So can you tell us when and where were you born?
So I was born in Houston, Texas, 1981, and sort of grew up there in Houston. My family, we lived closer into downtown, and then moved to California briefly for a year when I was in kindergarten, I think 5 or so, and then moved back to Houston when I was 6. And so I grew up in Clear Lake, which is a suburb between Houston and Galveston, and lived there basically until college.
Thank you. Can you describe the neighborhood in Clear Lake? Like what was the demographic like? What do you remember that was back then that might be no longer here now?
Yeah, so the neighborhood I grew up in was kind of Bay Forest. It was a neighborhood in Clear Lake. It was just sort of very classically suburban. That's how I would describe it or think about it. A lot of kind of families whose parents worked at NASA or who were engineers or doctors, kind of in the neighborhood. Not I didn't think it wasn't a particularly wealthy neighborhood or anything like that. It was, but it also was very sort of classically suburban. I thought, just in terms of, I remember riding bikes around the neighborhood. It was sort of very safe. People didn't really lock their doors, that kind of place. And just wandering around the neighborhood as a kid, in a way that that now I would think, people just don't do that, in terms of kind of safety and those kinds of things. So, um, yeah, that's how I would describe it.
Thank you. And going back to your name, Kao Chang, and I remember your mother also mentioned you have a Chinese name. Can you share some of the stories behind your name? Like, is there a metaphor in your name or like a Chinese kind of, I know like Taiwanese names have a lot of different characters that have different meanings in each character. Is that the case for you?
Yeah. I don't know. I never, I, really tried to attach that much to my uh, Chinese name, although I'm curious as to whether others might ascribe more significance. There's a Zhang Henlei. That's my Chinese name. Which I understand to have some connotations of thunder and lightning. So I don't, I t- don't consider myself to be a lot of thunder and lightning, but um, that's my Chinese name.
Thank you. Very much reminded me of Thor or like Avengers. Looking at it, yeah. Can you describe the household you grew up in?
Sure, it was my mom, my dad, sister, and me. Sort of a very kind of median, kind of normal family. I think one aspect of it was that much of my extended family lived in other cities. A lot of extended family in California and in LA. So we didn't live with them, but would often kind of on the holidays kind of travel to California and kind of visit them and that kind of thing. But so as far as our household, it was just mom, dad, me, and my sister.
Great. And what does your sister do? Is she also in DC or Houston?
But she's in LA. She's in LA and she works at USC.
Great. Um, Great. Thank you. And what were your parents' occupation?
So my father was an engineer who worked at NASA, Johnson Space Center, and he worked on the space shuttle, the sort of mission support for the space shuttle. And then my mom was a stay-at-home mom, and she's also a writer and a journalist, author. So she had those jobs in addition to raising me and my sister.
Yeah, that's for many it's a job to stay home. Um, and next, I'm wondering, does your parents' occupation had any impact on your career decision?
I don't know. I mean, that's a great question. It doesn't look like it, right? Because I don't do a kind of science or engineering field. At the same time, um, you know, I'm a civil servant. I work for the government, just like my dad was a civil servant. Um, I think that's one thing that, and maybe another um, point where that might be relevant is my mother's kind of a journalist. Neither of my parents had particularly lucrative professions, and I think sort of that was one of the bigger choices for me coming out of law school. Go work at a big law firm or that kind of thing, um, or try and go into public service. And uh, you're not really sure why you do something, and not to get too overly sort of philosophical about free will and that kind of thing. But I would sort of throw out there that my parents, their sort of big life choices in terms of um, sort of choosing to do what mattered to them, the most in terms of meaningful professions. I think that probably influenced me as well in terms of maybe not pursuing the most lucrative profession, but doing something that I think to be meaningful.
Yeah, that was amazing. And I'm also wondering, did your parents bring you up studying Chinese, speaking Chinese, or like how important is Chinese culture and heritage in your education from your parents?
Yeah, that's a great question. And so I did go to Chinese school on the weekend growing up. As a kid, I remember that. Also, studied Chinese. Actually, my high school actually had Chinese, and so I studied Chinese in high school, and then a little bit in college. My Chinese is terrible, though. I just have to go out there, and notwithstanding my parents' best efforts to sort of teach me Chinese and that kind of thing. My terrible American accent. So I just haven't been able to do enough in that regard. But I would say Chinese culture and growing up, both the language and the culture has been very important to me growing up, and I think formed a large part of my experiences growing up. So.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. And I guess I felt compelled to ask since I visited like your parents' house and happened to see a lot of literature on her bookshelf, and I was just wondering if you grew up reading any of the Chinese literature back then.
Uh, no, my Chinese reading got pretty good at one point, but not, no, I'm really ashamed to say that I haven't done as much with that in terms of, reading Chinese literature. I briefly tried to read Sun Tzu Bingfa, given my kind of interest in uh, military stuff, but no, I didn't get very far with that.
Yeah, and I would definitely love to um, capture that part of the story regarding your earlier encounter with like warfare and its philosophy and so on. But before that, I was just wondering also what were some of the values that your parents emphasized in your upbringing?
Um, I would say sort of the standard the standard things like, hard work, education being really important. Um, these are it was in many respects, it was, I think, a very, sort of stereotypical kind of emphasis of a family, being the most important thing. I remember my dad always saying, uh, talking about how important it was to be close to my sister. My sister and I actually didn't get along very much, when we were little. Where now we get along great, but I didn't get along very much with my sister. Or we fought a lot when we were kids, and I always remember my dad sort of emphasizing the importance of, family, and your sister is the most important, is the closest person to you, after after me and your mom. So I think, just sort of the standard things of family, hard work, education, those kinds of things.
Yeah, thank you. And I'm also wondering, in your childhood, what was your earliest and distinct memory?
Of being Chinese. Is that right? Is that the question?
Just being a child, like what's a distinct memory of your childhood growing up? Not, I mean, either that can relate to your Asian identity or not.
Yeah. I don't know. This is a tough one. I, just a couple random thoughts about my childhood. One of which was that, although, I think my parents emphasized a lot of the values that, you know, Chinese American families, other Asian American families emphasize. I don't think I was like, they were like tiger parents, they weren't they weren't like that, in terms of being very kind of prescriptive, or, it definitely wasn't, um, kind of helicopter parenting kind of things about, oh, you have to be a doctor or something like that. Now I might be that way with my son. I might, say, hey, you got to be a doctor. But my parents definitely weren't that way with me. Um, the earliest memories, I have a terrible memory, so let me just put that out there first. But I do remember, I read a lot when I was a kid, a lot of like science fiction books and fantasy books and that kinds of things. And I just remember sitting in my room, sort of in the sunlight, relaxing, reading, and sort of just enjoying that feeling of being able to open a book and sort of go wherever and whenever, far off lands and that kind of thing. So,
Yeah, that's incredible, that you started reading at such a young age. And I was also wondering, what is it like growing up as an Asian kid in your neighborhood? Were there many Asian family in Clear Lake back then?
yes, I thought so. Now, I'm not sure if statistically there were, but um, but I just remember my friends growing down up, sort of down the street or in the neighborhood, and I would say, about half my friends growing up were, Asian, of Asian descent, Asian American descent. A lot of Chinese American families in the neighborhood. A lot of friends growing up also, were not of Asian descent. So, I think a fairly diverse neighborhood. Um, but and that was, I guess that was maybe one of the comments I would add um, about the neighborhood, that, or my Asian identity, that it was always, around. I think some folks maybe grew up in a, um, maybe in one place where, they say they grew up in Taiwan or something and immigrated at an early age. There's a sort of a transition where, you know, um, you would, now become much more aware of your kind of Asian identity when you're no longer in Asia, right? But for me, it was always growing up. It was always there that, I was an Asian American kid, you know, and had lots of. It wasn't as though, um, you know, there weren't any others like me. There was lots of them like me around, but also, you know, there were lots of people who weren't like that. So, uh, so that was always an aspect of my identity.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. And I'm also wondering if you felt any distinct conversations you had with your parents or grandparents and so on regarding the generational differences and generational gaps, or anything that you felt that is um, pretty distinct between first and second generation and immigrants.
Yeah, I don't really recall sort of specific things like that, you know, with my parents or with members of the previous generation, you know, or my parents or uncles or aunts and that kind of thing. Um, you know, I do really actually remember this one discussion, you know, from my Chinese class in high school. Um, and it was with a guy named Tony who was um, I think he was first generation immigrant, or pretty close to that. And I just remember him saying at one point, just talking about how it, it was basically the comment, the gist of it was, you know, that my kids wouldn't sort of really learn Chinese in the same way, right? Just because, you know, I'm as I mentioned, my Chinese isn't that good, and so there is really kind of a sense of, you know, sort of transition or change, and and you know, that conversation has sort of stuck with me as something, you know, that yeah, it was in a hostile way. It was just a sort of an observation or something like that. And it's one that's sort of definitely true that my you know, my son isn't going to grow up in the same way in terms of a household with um, sort of a strong native Chinese speakers, and it's going to be different. And so I definitely feel that sort of change, and that's something that is just, I think, part of my experience.
Yeah, that's so interesting. And since you brought up your next generation, I'm wondering what kind of values would you instill with your children in their childhood?
Well, I'm thinking a lot about this
Yeah.
because my I have a son, and he's coming up on 3 years old right now. So um, so a lot of thought into, you know, how do you how do you do this? How do you you know, raise somebody to be a good person? You know, I think that's, you know, the most important thing. And then and you want, you know, very, you know, the most basic things to be taken care of. You know, I just want to make sure he doesn't become a criminal or a drug addict or something like that, you know. um and you know, keep him safe. So you know, it's um I'd say it's a big part of my identity right now, trying to be a dad and trying to uh kind of be a good dad. And it causes a lot of reflections in my mind about you know, my own parents, and sort of understanding them in a way that I didn't before you know, when I didn't have a kid. So um, you know, I guess I just hope to kind of do all the same things. And you know, my dad always, you know, tried to, I think, stress an upward progression, like, you know, you're going to have it better than me, you know, and in terms of more opportunities and that kind of thing. And so that's sort of what I hope to pass on to my son.
Yeah, that's incredible. And we definitely love to revisit that in a little bit after we cover your education experiences. So, can you speak a little bit about your school, like from, say, middle school, junior high to high school? And then we'll cover your college experience later.
Sure. So I went just the intermediate school down the street. Literally walked to school. It was just very kind of classically suburban kind of thing. And then the high school was also also sort of down the street too. Um, and it was a large public high school, 3,000 some kids. 3,000. Well, yeah, a little more than 3,000 kids, I think. So just a fairly large public high school in Texas, and enjoyed it and um, had a great time.
Great. What were some of your favorite subjects back then?
Um, Favorite subject, and I don't know really. Actually, I'm no. One I think I remember in high school was that it was very sort of difficult, right? Just in terms of the schedule and then the extracurricular activities. And then, I just, one of my memories is, and that you could do this when you were a high school student. I remember like eating an ice cream float, like getting ice cream and then putting a Coke or root beer on it. And I remember doing this at like, 9 or 10 in the evening, it's just so I had enough energy to finish my homework and sort of power through the day and that kind of thing. More than the subjects, I remember, some of the teachers, I guess some of my English teachers, um, being, people who were kind of inspiring and, hardworking and who tried to, um, you know, it, who, really just tried to do a great job as teachers. So, um,
Thank you. And what were some of your like friends demographic like in the school in general?
yeah, I think about again, I'm not sure actually what the demographic makeup of the school was, probably, as a general matter. But a lot of my friends were, I think I mentioned about half of them were, kind of like me, you know, children of Asian American immigrants. A lot of Chinese, a lot of South Asian immigrants in the area, and then a lot were. Um, just sort of regular sort of white folks, and then not as much uh, African American or Hispanic friends. Although I did have African American and Hispanic friends growing up. So
And did you pick up any sports or musical instrument or any hobbies that you carried on through your current life?
yeah, so I mean this is sort of the stereotypical thing, but I played piano growing up. That's a good Chinese kid playing piano until I was about 6, and then I played the trombone after that, all through middle school and high school, and I was a sort of a band nerd. I was in the band, the marching band. That's exceptionally nerdy. And then my friends also did orchestra and that kind of thing. My friends also had a just sort of a small band that wasn't affiliated with the school, but was just sort of like jazz or swing and that kind of thing. And that's one of the things that we did, which was a lot of fun. It's a lot of fun growing up.
Great. And moving on to your college life. So you went to Yale College, and that is part of Yale University, right?
Right, right, right. Yale College is the undergraduate part of the university. um, and really enjoyed it. Really enjoyed it there. But continued to play trombone actually for a couple of years there so, too as well. So
Yeah. And you study ancient Greek literature.
that's right. That's right. So I was in this, the freshman year, they have this program called Directed Studies, which is a great books program where you study history, literature, philosophy, and sort of study the canonical works of, Western civilization, I guess. Um, and so I think I really enjoyed that program freshman year. And then that sort of sparked in me an interest in ancient Greek history. And then in particular, um, there was a professor named Donald Kagan, who's now emeritus, but was a sort of renowned classical historian. Um, and um, and I became one of those people who took all of Don Kagan's classes and sort of really sort of was inspired, by that. Also, took ancient Greek at UT Austin one summer. They have these sort of intensive courses where you sort of study for 12 weeks, 8 hours a day, kind of thing, and they cram a bunch of hours of instruction in the language. So.
Do you still speak ancient Greek?
Yeah, I mean, no, nobody really speaks ancient Greek anymore. There is something called the Erasmian pronunciation or other pronunciations, but I do sort of from time to time read a little bit. That's one thing that I've enjoyed doing and uh, continue to do just sort of for fun every once in a while.
What are some
That's
of oh,
Well, I was gonna say that's my bookshelf. The green books on the bookshelf are all classical books.
and what are some of the exciting and new things that you discover in history, and in particular that really ancient history that you felt like the current civilization should learn more from?
Yeah, it was. That was exactly why I loved it. I think, or what was um, uniquely terrific about it was, this idea of people who are sort of separated from you by hundreds of years, if not thousands of years, and they're writing down ideas um, and you're having a conversation with people, um, who are separated by such distance from you, both in sort of time and space. But at the same time, you're able to, really have a dialogue with them. And so that to me was what was so interesting about it, was this idea that some of these writings, Plato and Aristotle and others, um, with Thucydides, when the people are trying to draw observations about history, about politics, about government, um, that these are things of enduring relevance that, over the centuries, people have constantly looked back to. Um, and the fact that there is such a gulf between us and them, yet at the same time we're able to sort of profit from their writing. I think that's one of the sort of the most beautiful things to me about the classics is just being able to have that, kind of conversation with people from antiquity.
Wow, that's really inspiring. And I hope after reading about your oral history, people will start picking up that subject more. And I'm wondering, so you study literature, which is like philosophy, and not so much as like the Greek myths, or both?
So mostly what I studied was I'd say history and political philosophy. And so there's the first historians, Herodotus and Thucydides. I read a lot of Thucydides when I was in college. I was one of our roommates would always joke about that because I'd have he asked what I was reading, and I would say, "Well, I'm reading Thucydides," and he's like, "You've been reading Thucydides, for." He complained that I was taking the same course over and over again. Um, but there's a lot to unpack in it. And so he wrote a history. Thucydides wrote a history of the Peloponnesian War. Also studied a lot of Plato, sort of the political philosopher Plato and his writings. Um, and so that was sort of the focus of my studies. I wrote um, a, a paper on. I think my senior paper was about sort of the ancient Greek notions of democracy and sort of what it meant to them. And the gist of the paper was that all of our understandings of ancient Greek democracy, things like Athenian democracy, really come from people who are sharply critical of it. So Plato and others are actually very critical of it as an institution. And so I think my paper was trying to understand, well, if you were somebody who actually believed in democracy and not one of its harshest critics, what would you explain it to be? How would you promote this idea? And so that was sort of one of the things I studied.
Wow, that's incredible. Yeah, thank you. And I guess moving on, like, what was your decision to transition from ancient Greek studies to studying law and becoming a JD?
Yeah, so I remember one of my college professors who was sort of an advisor for me senior year, and I remember talking to him a lot. Victor Bears, kind of a classics professor. I think he's also emeritus now. Um, and I remember Professor Bears saying, when I told him I was thinking of going to law school, he was like, "Well, here's who you write the checks to. Make sure you put the classics department on the check, because otherwise they'll give it to the football team or something like that." Um, so if you study classics, there aren't as many obvious career paths, sort of, other than being a classicist or a professor. Um, so law was sort of a way to find a job, I think, after college. um, and that was I would say that was one of the reasons why people should not go to law school in retrospect. Um, if advising kind of younger people today, I would say, if you're just looking for a degree that will help you get a job, you should probably not go to law school. You should probably pick a different degree. But for me, I think it turned out okay because temperamentally, I think I enjoyed law school a lot and enjoyed the legal profession. So it probably wasn't the right reason, but it fortuitously worked out for me.
Yeah, that's so interesting. And you, after Harvard Law School, you also went to do a few internships and like started out trying to go down the lawyer career route, right?
Yeah, so sort of during law school, I worked at some law firms in Houston in the summer, and then ended up after law school, working for the Department of Defense, right afterwards. So had some fairly, I would say, normal, what are called summer associate clerkships, sort of during law school, at some law firms, and then ultimately decided not to go back to Houston or Texas to practice law, but instead to work at DoD after law school.
So did you just kind of become interested in Department of Defense, or like what there's some kind of event or incident that happened that draw you to that?
Yeah. So how did I end up at the Department of Defense? I would say that 9/11, which happened when I was in college, actually had a big impact on me in terms of um, thinking about what I wanted to do. Uh, After law school, I was actually initially supposed to uh, join the Army as a lawyer. So I'd applied to the Army Judge Advocate program and had been accepted. And was actually going through like the physicals and everything, to join the military. When basically was in one of my law professor's office hours one day, sort of third year law school, and was sort of talking to him about what I wanted to do, and he suggested working at the Defense Department, sort of in a civilian capacity, um, and I was like, well, sure, why not? That would be interesting, and he emailed. Somebody he knew at the Defense Department at the time, the general counsel of the Defense Department, and got me an interview. And then that's how I sort of ended up at DoD.
Yeah, it's so interesting you brought up 911 as part of that motivation. And do you remember what were you what were you doing where you were, and how did you feel when you first heard about the 911?
Yeah, I remember where I was. I was actually it was very strange. I was actually like I went to the I remember waking up and then the TV was on, and my college roommates were all sort of watching the TV, um, and learning about what happened. Um, and I would say um, for me, I think one of the things that it reinforced was this notion, um, that kind of history wasn't over, right? That there was a sort of an idea in vogue at the time in our political science classes: is history over? Is there really a sort of a progression to sort of this new world order where everything's very peaceful and people work out all their problems sort of diplomatically and through international institutions, and sort of war is something of the past? And I think that was um, sort of for me something. Well, actually, I think that'd be very nice if history were over, but in fact, history's not over. And so, the I think that was something that shaped a lot of my viewpoints, and a lot of the um, the sort of interest in classics and those kinds of things.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I'm sure that 911 has got so much stories in each of our memories that each of us has contributed to this collective memory will go down in the generations as well. And I'm also wondering, so you've done a lot of work at the Department of Defense, including written part of the chapters, part of the war manuals. Can you speak a little bit more about the work that you've been doing at the DoD?
Sure, happy to do that. So I'm a lawyer at the Department of Defense and a sort of an associate general counsel. I work at the that means I'm very, very low ranking. I don't have I'm a very junior person. Uh, the so I work in the International Affairs Division at the Office of General Counsel, and the specific area that I work on is kind of public international law, the laws of war. So it's a body of international law that governs armed conflict, and it addresses things like or includes things like the Geneva Conventions of 1949, which relate to the protection of war victims, protections of prisoners of war, protections of civilians. So that's sort of my job in a nutshell, is to advise on international humanitarian law, laws of war, uh, and provide that advice to senior officials at the department, provide that advice to policymakers. Sometimes we'll represent the department in various uh, international capacities or intergovernmental discussions. So
That's really interesting. And I'm also wondering, with your thesis that you did at Yale regarding democracy, did that also kind of contributed to part of your written work regarding um, technology and weaponry?
I don't think so. I mean, they're pretty far apart. I guess that's why my reaction. Um, I think the Greeks who were Democrats who believed in democracy, right? They defined it in terms of the rule of law. That was one of the key characteristics of their form of government. And then the other um, key point about it, is from a line in a speech given by Pericles, that they call it a democracy because it's administered for the benefit of the many rather than the few. And so this idea that the essence of democracy isn't that you have every single person deciding on every single issue by a vote, but that the public good, the the government should be administered for the benefit of the many, being the central characteristic. And I don't know that that's particularly been uh, impactful on my work, other than to say that I think that the same spirit of I think rule of law and uh, is sort of at the core of all the lawyers who work in the government. That this is sort of incredibly important for us. This is what we do, is help the government abide by the law, and help the officials who are sworn to uphold the law adhere to their oaths to do so.
So, what do you envision in 20 years the um, the Earth will be like, in terms of like government and AI and weaponry?
I don't know. That's a great question. There's a philosopher who's noted that predictions are hard because they're about the future. Um, so I would join myself in that observation by Mr. Yogi Berra, I believe. Uh, I think the long term fundamentals of our country are very strong. So I'm confident. I'm hopeful. That the things that have made America, the United States, a strong and successful country will um, continue to do that. You know, Rule of law, innovation, encouraging free thinking, um, and that kind of culture. So I'm hopeful that those qualities will continue in our country, and will um, continue to have a role in making the world a better place. So that's my hope, if not a prediction.
Thank you for sharing that. And yeah, I'm also very curious since your family background, your dad being working at the NASA and as an engineering, and that probably, I don't know, that contributed to your very scientific and logical mind. And also your mom being a writer who has, yeah, like, and also a lot of studies in Chinese literature. I'm wondering, have that both parts from your parents contributed or in any way impacted your current work as a lawyer and also a writer in terms of this very essential work at the DoD?
I don't know. I don't know. I mean, I hate to just sort of uh, sort of confess so much ignorance about where I came from and or who I am and how I became to be who I am. But I like to think that what you're saying is correct. That that there's parts of me that came from my parents, including uh, a more logical part, that sort of scientific part, and then more literary part. I think that's one of the more um, interesting things about the law and the legal profession is that it's a combination of both of those things. Um, Kind of an essential logic, which is supposed to underlie the law, but also, it's supposed to, persuade people at the end of the day who uh, often are not logical and rational. And um, so I think the law is a merger of those two sort of strands.
Yeah, it's such a interesting combination, and yeah, and also very really essential and part of the nation. And I guess the next few questions will be on discussion about some of the questions in our racial justice and civic engagement special collection. Um, as we just passed by the current election 2 months ago, as well as coming up to the exchange of power, what are some of the key factors that impacted your voting decision earlier last year?
I think that anyone, when thinking about leaders, about who would lead our country, I think it's important to think about policies. What policies would be most advanced by the choice of candidate. I think character is also incredibly important. Does is the person um, have the character? I think with any, I think one of the things about government is that you sort of never know what's going to happen next. That people have plans and policies about what will happen in the future, but there's going to be something like 9/11 or Katrina or the COVID pandemic, that the challenges that the government's going to face, that the American people are going to face, are going to be unexpected. And so one of the most important things in choosing a leader is does the person have the character? Does the person have the um, uh, competence and skills necessary to deal with those unforeseen circumstances? So I think those are just some general considerations that I would say are important or should be important to people in choosing an elected official.
And what are your thoughts about the assignment of Kamala Harris that will become the first woman of color in the White House?
I mean, I think that's great, right? I mean, I'm um, in terms of kind of diversity and um, advancing the government. I think you know, on the one hand, it's important just to, you know, respect every person for who they are. You know, not being you can't reduce people to kind of a racial ethnic identity. You know, so I think that's you know, that's important that people be judged and commended for their kind of personal accomplishments and achievements. You know, but at the same time, you know, I think it's an important hallmark of and a sign of a progressing society when there's more kind of diversity in the ranks of leadership, and I think that you know, having a diverse background and officials of a diverse background is important. Um, you know, one you know, one reflection, you know, from my time at the Department of Defense, one of the things that I've been, I think, really proud of is the fact that, you know, when I would go on a delegation, a U.S. delegation, join a U.S. delegation to, you know, some kind of international conference, you know, if you look at the U.S. side, it would often be a fairly diverse group of people, you know, people of different ethnic backgrounds, people of different people who didn't all look the same, you know, and then you know, when you in most of the times in dealing with people from other countries, they didn't have that as much, and so I think that's, you know, one of the things that's a great strength of our country, and one of the particular, you know, kind of points of pride that I've had in getting to serve the department.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. And yeah, I totally agree that at some point, like being like racially equal, it doesn't mean that overlooking one's racial qualities, but yeah, but like as a whole package. And next, I'm wondering, what's your relationship with Black Lives Matter?
I wouldn't say that I have a particular relationship with Black Lives Matter. You know, I've been, you know, sort of participated in the organization or advocacy work along those lines. You know, none of my you know, job duties or anything have anything to do with that. You know, kind of thing. You know, I think you know, I I've thought a lot about, you know, racial justice and you know, that's racial justice in our country, and I think that's one of the things that's personally important to me as an issue. Um, you know, but I don't have a particular relationship with the Black Lives Matter movement.
Yeah, thank you for sharing. Um, and I guess moving on, as I'm curious, as with your work, it has so many portrayal in mainstream media. Like we've been seeing the very popular TV series, The Black Mirrors. Was there, or just wondering if there's any um, TV shows that you consider that is a very interesting portrayal of the future of like AI and technology in our society?
That's a great question. So, so generally, I think you know, you know, I think the government has tried to well, in the matters that I work on, I think sort of tried to keep the discussions more realistic and not focused on things that are sort of related to science fiction or that kind of thing. I think the I think one of the things that at least on the areas that I work on, there's a is how sort of incremental these kinds of technologies are. In other words, so there's a famous saying that the future is already here. It's just not distributed evenly yet, and so I think along the same lines, a lot of the technologies that are being used are and that will probably be very influential in the future are sort of already here. Um, it's just a question of them being perhaps more widely used or used in different ways, as well as kind of significant advances in the technological capabilities. Sorry, this isn't a very good response to your question. I'm trying to. Yeah, yeah. I don't know. I don't know. That's a good question, but I'm at a loss to say if there's any sort of particular um, science fiction depiction that I would commend.
Or would there be any like novel or writing that you think that really influence you in your thoughts, not only kind of in your scholarship work, but also just in your for your leisure?
Yeah, maybe going back to the discussion about classics. I think one of and the directed studies program, that I went through in college. One of the really enjoyable aspects of it was just reading so many different thinkers who were writing about about the same ideas in some instance, and sort of having a different perspective on it. And one of the things that always struck me was how some of the writers I would really get and be like, oh, I think like this person, or this person's mode of writing is very clear. And even though they're writing 300 400 years ago, I feel like I could sit down and have a conversation, and we would sort of really sync up. And then others whom I would read and like, this is a terrible writer, and I completely don't. I completely disagree with all their conclusions, and that kind of thing. So I, I would say that there's one sort of modern philosopher whom I like a lot. His name is Nassim Taleb. And he's written a book called The Black Swan, which is very famous, very popular, as well as a number of other books. But I definitely enjoy his writing style, as well as his kind of resort to a lot of the insights from behavioral economics and psychology about human nature, as well as the basic point that people are not very good at understanding the limitations of their own knowledge. And so, it's a point which comes really from Socrates, Plato's Apology, where sort of Socrates makes the point that sort of the essence of wisdom is knowing that, knowing what we don't know, to understand our own ignorance, is sort of the first step of understanding, and that too often people think they know when they do not know, and that this is perhaps the most dangerous thing, is when someone thinks that they know something but they actually don't know something. So so I guess that's why I'm also very hesitant to make any predictions about the future, because I'm certain that I know for certain that I don't know what will happen in the future.
Yeah, thank you. And I also admire your modesty, being such a highly achieving person. And I would definitely love to, as that you were talking about the human ignorance from Greek literature. What has COVID-19 told us about, yeah, like the world and mankind? If you're interested to share with us.
I don't have any brilliant insights about COVID-19. I don't think. I think I'm just trying to survive it like everybody else, in terms of um, kind of hunkering down and surviving the kind of quarantine. I'm a bit of a hermit and a misanthrope to begin with, so it actually wasn't. It's probably much less burdensome for me than for other people. But even I, sort of am yearning to, throw a party and have friends over and for dinner and that kind of thing. And just really looking forward to the day then that we can all do that. I think, there's of course a tragic aspect to this that millions of people have died, or will die from it. But at the same time, I think there's the other side of the story is technology and how fast people have been able to develop vaccines, or figure out the modes of transmission of the virus, and what steps can be taken to stop it. And so I think there is a positive story here too, especially when one considers that sort of plagues and pandemics are something which people regularly through history have encountered, and this is one of those where we're now able to meet it with sort of advanced technologies, and in a way that probably saves a lot more lives that than would be without those technologies.
Yeah, absolutely. Like the speed of how human become so adapted to Zoom as we are doing so now is really incredible. And I'm also wondering, how have your like relationship with your loved ones been since the start of the pandemic?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's good. Me and my wife are sort of taking care of our son at home, who's, as I mentioned, coming up on 3. And so it's been a challenge to um, have a crazy toddler running around the house, and then kind of work from home and all that. So that's been um, it's been tough. That's been difficult, but it's also really an unexpected blessing too, because if he was in sort of daycare as would normally be the case, I wouldn't get to see so much of him his growing up. So I've really gotten um, something very special about it, in terms of being able to kind of watch him grow through a very formative period. And so um, that's something I'll treasure. Um, of course, it's also been difficult not being able to visit with my mom, who's in Houston. But I think we're surviving over here.
Well, thank you so much for sharing that. And we all hope this will be over soon and you get to visit your mom here in Houston and hopefully the Rice campus sometime soon. Um, And I guess as we're approaching the end of the interview, just want to ask if you would be interested to kind of do a time capsule with us for your son, your future grandchildren, and the generations to come. Like any messages you would like to leave for them?
So how does is it literally a time capsule kind of thing that y'all are planning to open, or is it just sort of an open-ended thing? I'm just curious.
Sure, it will be, I guess, an open-ended because it will be published. And but I would hope this is like a legacy project that your children will be interested to find out more about their grandparents. Your grandchildren or future generations will be interested to hear what their grandparents and so on, what they were like, what they talked about, and what their occupations were. Um, yeah, to build that connection, I think it's really interesting. I hope you would, be interested to participate.
Sure. So I wrote this essay that I've shared with some friends, but I would read it out and contribute it to the time capsule aspect of it, if that's okay. It's probably 6 to 8 minutes long, so it's a little long, but
Yes, yes,
if
please.
we've got time.
Yeah, we do have time. Yeah, definitely. That would be really amazing.
Okay, let me pull it up. So this is my essay that I wrote, that I've shared with a few friends. But I did want to share it more broadly, and I've titled it "Life, Death, and the Laws of War." I didn't see how much death was in my job until my dad died. Since 2006, I've worked as a lawyer for the U.S. Department of Defense. I worked on a lot of interesting things, mostly at the Pentagon, but occasionally going to some interesting places: Guantanamo Bay, Geneva, The Hague, Kampala. Perhaps the biggest thing I worked on was the first department-wide manual on the law of war. There were lots of other people involved, but I was the chief author, really the scrivener. Some people get in my line of work because they've heard about atrocities in faraway places, the Holocaust, genocides in Africa. Maybe they studied international criminal courts in law school or interned for a human rights group. They're on the humanitarian side of the house. There's another side, the national security side, filled with people who've signed up to prevent atrocities at home. A couple months after 9/11, I visited Ground Zero. Somebody from my college arranged a large group of students to visit. I remember thinking that it looked just on TV. I remember thinking that it looked on TV, like scenes from a disaster movie. But what I really remember is the memorial that the families had already set up. A crayon drawing with the title, a crayon drawing with the title "World's Best Dad." A missing person flyer with a picture of a young Japanese tourist captioned, "Have you seen our son?" I couldn't stop crying on the dark bus ride back home to campus. I kept thinking about the kids of the firefighters and police officers who drew those pictures. I remembered how my dad was so pleased when I got him a kitschy mug that said "World's Best Dad." I kept thinking about how far from home that tourist was and how confused his parents must have been. I kept praying for a chance to do something so that memorials like that wouldn't go up. I promised God I'd give whatever I could if He gave me the chance to make a difference. After my dad died, I felt like the top layer of my skin was burned off, leaving my flesh raw, nerve endings exposed. My sister has always complained that I'm a robot incapable of emotion. That's not true, but I confess that I've tried to appear that way most of the time. I felt death everywhere it showed up in my job. They were planning a strike against an important target that was expected to cause a lot of civilian casualties. It was an ISIS controlled bulk cash storage site with millions of dollars. military jargon for a bank taken over by terrorists. The legal formula is that it is not prohibited to conduct attacks unless the expected civilian casualties are excessive compared to the concrete and direct military advantage expected to be gained. The textbook way to analyze this problem: hitting the target would save lives, it would take enemy fighters off the battlefield, the war would be shorter. If you take it too far, this logic is easy to ridicule. It was necessary to destroy the village to save it. But it's a hard logic to refute when you remember that lives are on both sides of the equation, when you remember that we're fighting genocidal assholes. The reason for the strike is to save refugees from being slaughtered on mountaintops, to protect marketplaces, nightclubs, and concerts. After my dad died, I still believed all the same things, still believed that war in far corners of the world was necessary to keep skyscrapers in lower Manhattan from falling down. But I felt different thinking it. It's different when death visits you intimately. It was strange feeling different, but even stranger not talking about it with anyone. I remember a meeting with people from Doctors Without Borders after we hit their hospital in Kunduz. The official explanation was that their people died in a tragic incident caused by a combination of human errors compounded by process and equipment failures. The meeting was about the department's efforts to express condolences, to show them that we were really, really sorry. It was a small meeting. I had a bit part, but I just wanted to tell them that we knew death, that I knew death, how many people in the room on our side had lost someone. It would have been weird to just blurt out, my dad died, my friend died in Iraq, we feel your pain. I wasn't sure that everyone on our side did. I did, but I didn't blurt anything out. I just played my part, explained the legal points, tried to sound like a robot. I saw later that the strike was successful in destroying the target. CNN reported that US commanders would have considered up to 50 civilian casualties for the strike, but that perhaps only 5 to 7 people died. I wondered who they were. I wondered if anyone was crying for mom or dad. I was supposed to give a talk in New York on the department's Law of War manual on the margins of some UN meetings. It was a big deal for me, my first public talk after years of spending most of my spare hours on that manual, kind of a debutante ball. I came up to Manhattan the night before. My talk was supposed to be the next morning. My mom called me in the middle of the night to tell me that my dad died, then to tell me that the doctors were trying to save him and that she had to go because the doctors needed to talk to her. I remember it being dark, checking out of the hotel, walking to the train station in the middle of the night, riding the train back to DC, learning he died, catching a flight back to Houston. On the way home, I kept breaking down, crying, when I couldn't hold the sadness inside me. A couple of years earlier, I went to my uncle's funeral, and I just couldn't understand how my cousin gave the eulogy about his dad so calmly. I thought there was no way I could ever do that. But I did. I still remember what the sky felt like that day. It was perfect weather, Houston in November. At one of the first interagency meetings after I came back to work, a senior lawyer at the State Department, whom I respect a lot, came up to me and asked if I was okay. I didn't know what to say, and he preempted any awkward silence, blurting out that of course I wasn't okay, that it'd be like 7 years before I was okay, that I'd never really be okay again. He told me a story about how after his dad died, a senior lawyer awkwardly told him it'd be good to go back to work. It was comforting knowing that other people have been through what you're going through, and what he said was comforting too. You really don't want to be okay because you're afraid that if you're okay, it means your dad is really gone. I came to my job to justify the war, and I did a lot of that. But mostly, I worked to restrain the war. War means the authority to use military force, but it also means constraints. Fighting war means fighting by the law of war. I worked on DoD's regulations on treating detainees humanely, on an executive order on mitigating civilian casualties. I remember a year or so after I started my job, my sister suggested moving out to LA and trying to be a screenwriter with her. I remember reflexively, haughtily saying, no, I want to do something meaningful, important. I want to do something meaningful and important. But nowadays, I get tired of wars sometimes. I wonder if I made the right choice. I wonder if I kept my promise to God to give whatever I could. So many people have given so much, have given so much more to me, so much more than me. I don't want you to think that I'm saying that I learned a big life lesson from my dad's death, that it was good for me in some way. I wouldn't wish it on anyone, even though most everyone will suffer through darkness like this. I want you to know that behind the government's bland bureaucratic prose, there are real people, people with feelings, not robots. I want you to know the truths that I believe after my years of lawyering war. War is necessary. War is chaos, rife with honest mistakes. War, most of all, is death. And the laws of war, when they restrain the armed forces, and even when they justify killing, this law tries to protect life, mothers and fathers, daughters and sons. That's why they call it humanitarian law.
Wow, that was beautiful. Um, is that the end of it?
Yeah, yeah, that's the end of it.
Wow. I feel like you kind of put us into a kind of a time zone where there's just so much to think about and ruminate on. That's yeah, that was beautiful. Um, is there anything else you would like to share?
No, no, I think I'm okay. Um, no, but just appreciate the opportunity to contribute, to kind of share stories, and really appreciate the work you're doing in setting up this kind of archive, and letting people tell their stories. And so I just want to thank you for doing that.
Thank you.